There are places in America where history doesn't fade, it festers. St. Judith's Lutheran Church sat at the edge of Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, like a gravestone no one bothered to read anymore. The building was old, older than the paved roads that eventually reached it, older than the streetlights that never quite illuminated its stone face. It had been there since 1871, a modest structure with a single bell tower and narrow windows that let in almost no light. By 2019, it was nearly forgotten. The congregation had dwindled to fewer than 30 regular attendees, most of them over 70, most of them born within 10 miles of where they still lived. The church held services every Sunday, but the hymns sounded thin now, like echoes of something that used to matter. The townspeople drove past it on their way to work, on their way to the grocery store, on their way to anywhere else. It had become part of the landscape, invisible in the way that old things become when no one wants to remember what they were built for. Sarah Klein arrived on a Tuesday in October, hired by a family in Pittsburgh who wanted to trace their roots back to the 1880s. She was a genealogist by trade, meticulous and patient, the kind of person who could spend 8 hours in a basement archive and feel like she'd accomplished something. She had done this work for 15 years, and she was good at it. She knew how to read between the lines of parish records, how to cross-reference birth certificates with census data, how to find the people who had been erased by time or intention. The family who hired her had a simple request: find out where their great-great-grandmother had been born and whether she had any siblings. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. St. Judith's kept its records in a small room behind the sanctuary, a cluttered space that smelled like dust and old paper. The church secretary, a woman named Mrs. Hollis, had agreed to let Sarah work there for the week. Mrs. Hollis was in her late 70s, her hair white and thinning, her hands spotted with age. She moved slowly, spoke softly, and seemed uncomfortable the moment Sarah asked to see the baptism logs. She brought out 3 leather-bound volumes, each one covering roughly 20 years, and placed them on the table without meeting Sarah's eyes. Then she left the room and didn't come back. Sarah opened the first volume, dated 1871 to 1890, and began to read. The handwriting was cramped and fading, written in a mix of English and German, the ink turning brown with age. She found what she was looking for within an hour: the baptism of Anna Klein, born February 1884, parents listed as Johann and Greta Klein. But as she continued to flip through the pages, something else caught her attention. There were so many baptisms, dozens of them. Most were normal families bringing their newborns to be blessed, the dates of birth and baptism only weeks apart. But there was another pattern, one that didn't make sense. Between 1883 and 1901, there were 147 recorded baptisms of infants under the age of 3 months who were not listed with family names. Instead, they were marked as foundling, ward of the parish, or simply infant, unnamed. The entries were brief, clinical, and they appeared in clusters, sometimes 5 or 6 in a single month. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She pulled out the burial ledger, a separate volume kept in the same handwriting, and began to cross-reference. She went through every name, every date, and that's when the numbers stopped adding up. Out of 147 baptized infants, only 12 were listed in the burial records. 12. The rest had simply vanished from the church's official history. No graves, no death certificates, no records of adoption or transfer to another parish. They had been baptized, marked as alive, and then erased. Sarah stood up and walked to the door. She called for Mrs. Hollis, but there was no answer. She walked into the hallway and found the older woman standing near the front entrance, her arms crossed, her face pale. Sarah asked her directly, where were the other children buried? Mrs. Hollis didn't answer. She asked again, this time more firmly, and Mrs. Hollis shook her head and said in a voice that barely rose above a whisper that Sarah needed to leave. She said the church was closing early. She said Sarah could come back another day, but not today. Her hands were shaking. Sarah packed her things and left, but the unease followed her. She drove back to her hotel on the outskirts of town, a small roadside inn with thin walls and a flickering vacancy sign. She ate dinner alone, tried to work, tried to sleep. But the numbers kept circling in her mind. 147 baptisms, 12 burials. She lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and that's when she heard a soft scraping sound near the door. She sat up, heart pounding, and turned on the lamp. There was nothing. But when she opened the door, she found a folded piece of paper on the floor, slipped underneath while she'd been lying there. No envelope, no signature, just a single sentence written in blue ink, careful and deliberate. They weren't stillborn, they were still breathing. Sister Margaretha Voss arrived in Lehigh County in the spring of 1882, and from the very beginning, people spoke of her with something close to reverence. She came from a small village outside Hamburg, sent by the Lutheran Church as part of a mission program designed to serve the waves of German immigrants flooding into rural Pennsylvania. She was 34 years old, unmarried, educated in both theology and midwifery, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made people trust her before she ever spoke a word. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense. Her face was long and pale, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes a colorless grey that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But there was something about her presence that felt sacred. She wore the same grey wool dress every day, plain and high-necked, with a white linen cap that covered most of her hair. She spoke softly, in German-accented English, and when she smiled, it was always with her mouth closed, as if she were keeping something to herself. Father Ulrich, the parish priest at St. Judith's, praised her in nearly every sermon. He called her a gift from God, a woman of pure faith who had sacrificed the comforts of her homeland to serve the poorest and most desperate among them. And she did serve them. Within months of her arrival, Sister Margaretha had established herself as the most trusted midwife in 3 counties. She attended births in homes where no doctor would go, in cabins with dirt floors and leaking roofs, among families who spoke no English and had no money to pay. She delivered babies in the middle of the night, in blizzards, in the backs of wagons. She saved mothers who were bleeding out. She saved infants who were born too early, too small, too weak, and she never asked for anything in return. The families she helped began to call her a saint. Some women kissed her hands. Others wept when she left their homes, convinced that God himself had sent her. By 1883, Sister Margaretha had convinced Father Ulrich to fund the construction of a small wing adjacent to the church, a nursery, she called it, for unfortunate mothers who could not keep their children. There were many such women in those years, girls who had been seduced and abandoned, wives whose husbands had died or disappeared, widows with too many mouths to feed, immigrants who had arrived pregnant and alone, with no family and no means of support. Sister Margaretha told them all the same thing: bring the child to me, and I will care for it. I will find it a home, or I will raise it in the faith. You will not be judged. You will not be shamed. The church will provide. And they came. From Allentown, from Bethlehem, from towns so small they didn't have names on any map. They came in carriages, on foot, in the middle of the night. Some left their babies on the doorstep of the nursery without ever knocking. Others sat with Sister Margaretha in the small receiving room, holding their infants one last time while she spoke to them in that soft, patient voice, assuring them that they were doing the right thing, that God understood, that the child would be loved. She never turned anyone away. She never asked too many questions, and she never, ever let anyone inside the nursery after dark. The mothers who gave her their children described the experience in similar ways. There was relief. Yes, relief that the burden had been lifted, that the shame could be buried, that they could return to their lives without the constant reminder of their mistake. But there was also something else, something harder to name. Unease, a feeling that settled in the chest and wouldn't leave. One woman, a young German immigrant named Elsa Brandt, wrote about it in her diary years later. She had given birth to a son out of wedlock in 1884, and she had brought him to Sister Margaretha when he was only 2 weeks old. She described sitting in the receiving room, the baby wrapped in a blanket, while Sister Margaretha stood across from her with her hands folded, waiting. Elsa had tried to explain why she couldn't keep him no husband, no money, no future, but Sister Margaretha had simply nodded and said that she understood that many mothers faced this same heartbreak, that the church would care for the child as if he were her own. Then she had reached out and taken the baby from Elsa's arms. And Elsa wrote this: She held my son like she was weighing him, not cradling him, not comforting him, weighing him, as if she were deciding something. Elsa left the nursery that day and never saw her son again. She never received a letter telling her he had been adopted. She never received word that he had died. He simply disappeared into Sister Margarethi's care, like so many others. The nursery itself was a modest structure, built onto the eastern side of the church with funds donated by wealthy parishioners who wanted to support Sister Margarethi's holy work. It had a main room with cribs and bassinets, a small kitchen, and a back room that Sister Margaretha used for storage and private prayer. The windows were always covered with thick curtains, even during the day. The door was always locked. Father Ulrich visited occasionally, but he never stayed long, and he never asked to see the children. The townspeople assumed that Sister Margaretha was simply protective, that she wanted to shield the infants from the prying eyes of a judgmental world. And perhaps that was true. But there was another truth, one that no one wanted to see. No one ever heard the babies cry at night. No one ever saw them playing in the yard. No one ever saw them grow. By 1885, Sister Margaretha Voss had become untouchable. She was beloved, revered, beyond question. And in the silence of that nursery, in the hours after dark when the curtains were drawn and the door was locked, she did the work she believed God had called her to do. She sorted the weak from the strong. She tested their will to live. She gave them a choice, she told herself, though they were too small to understand it. And when they failed, when they stopped breathing, when their tiny hearts gave out in the darkness, she baptized them one final time and whispered a prayer over their bodies. Then she carried them away, wrapped in cloth, and buried them where no one would ever find them. She felt no guilt. She felt no horror. She felt only the cold, methodical certainty that she was doing what needed to be done. And the town, in its ignorance and its gratitude, called her a saint. Sarah Klein spent the next 3 days in the county records office, a cramped building in downtown Allentown that smelled like mildew and old ink. She requested everything related to Street, Judith's Lutheran Church construction permits, land deeds, tax assessments, anything that might explain the discrepancy between the baptisms and the burials. The clerk, a middle-aged man with reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck, seemed annoyed by the volume of her requests, but he brought her what she asked for, box after box of yellowed documents that hadn't been touched in decades. Sarah went through them methodically, page by page, making notes, cross-referencing dates. And then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found it. The architectural plans for the church nursery were filed with Lehigh County in March of 1884, submitted by a local builder named Frederick Hahn. The plans were simple, drawn in pencil on large sheets of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were beginning to tear. The main nursery was laid out as expected, a rectangular room with space for cribs, a small kitchen area, shelving for supplies. But there was another room, marked clearly on the blueprint, tucked into the back corner of the structure. It was small, roughly 9 feet by 12 feet, with no windows. The only entrance was through the main nursery. There were no other doors, no other exits. And in the corner of the blueprint, in neat handwriting, someone had labeled it, the breathing room. Sarah stared at the plans for a long time, trying to make sense of it. A breathing room. What did that mean? She photographed the blueprint with her phone and sent copies to 2 local historians she'd been in contact with, along with a message asking if they'd ever heard the term used in church architecture. Both replied within hours. Neither had any idea. One suggested it might have been a ventilation space, a utility room of some kind. The other said it was probably just an old-fashioned term for a storage closet. But Sarah didn't believe either explanation. Storage closets didn't need labels like that. Ventilation spaces weren't accessible only from the inside of another room. And there was something else, something she noticed when she looked more closely at the blueprint. The room had no vents marked on the plans. No air ducts, no chimneys, just a single notation near the floor line that read, air openings, per specifications. She made calls. She contacted the current church board and asked if anyone knew what the breathing room had been used for. No one did. She reached out to the diocese, to the Lutheran Historical Society, to retired clergy who had served in the area. Most didn't respond. The few who did said they'd never heard of such a room. One elderly pastor told her that old church buildings often had strange features, rooms built for purposes that were never documented, spaces that were abandoned or repurposed over the years. He suggested she let it go, but Sarah couldn't let it go, because the more she thought about it, the more wrong it felt. A windowless room, locked from the outside, in a nursery full of infants. She found the name of a former maintenance worker through a local genealogy forum, someone who had mentioned in passing that his grandfather had worked at St. Judith's in the 1920s. His name was Raymond Colt, and he was 83 years old, living in a small assisted care facility just outside of Bethlehem. Sarah called and asked if she could visit. Raymond said yes, though he didn't sound enthusiastic about it. When she arrived, she found him sitting in a common room, a frail man with thin white hair and hands that trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee. She explained who she was and what she was researching, and Raymond listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Then she asked him if his grandfather had ever mentioned a room called the breathing room. Raymond was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. He said his grandfather, a man named Otto Colt, had worked as a custodian at the church from 1921 until his death in 1936. Otto didn't talk much about the job, but there was one story he told more than once, usually late at night when he'd had too much to drink. He said there was a room in the old nursery wing that gave him nightmares. A small room, tucked in the back, with a heavy wooden door. The door locked from the outside, Otto had said, with a metal bolt that could only be opened from the hallway. And the floor of that room, Raymond continued, had holes drilled into it. Small holes, maybe the size of a coin, scattered across the wooden planks. Otto said he'd asked the priest about it once, and the priest told him it was for ventilation, that the room had been used for storage and needed airflow to prevent mold. But Otto didn't believe that. He said the holes were too deliberate, too evenly spaced. He said they looked like someone had measured them out, like someone had planned them, and then Raymond said something that made Sarah's stomach turn. He said his grandfather told him the holes were drilled so that air could come up from the basement below, but only a little bit of air, just enough to keep something alive, not comfortable, just alive. Sarah left the facility and drove straight back to Lehigh County. She contacted a contractor, a man named Dennis Shaw, who specialized in historical building restoration. She told him she needed someone to examine the basement of St. Judith's Lutheran Church, specifically the area directly beneath where the old nursery wing had been. Dennis was hesitant at first. He didn't like working with churches, he said, because they were always too cheap to pay for proper work. But when Sarah offered to cover his consultation fee out of pocket, he agreed. 2 days later, they met at the church. Mrs. Hollis wasn't there. The building was locked. Sarah had to call the church office 3 times before someone finally agreed to let them in. The basement was dark and damp, the kind of space that hadn't been cleaned or maintained in years. The air smelled like rot and standing water. Dennis brought a work light and a set of tools, and together they made their way to the section of the basement that would have been directly beneath the breathing room. The ceiling was low, made of old wooden beams that sagged in places. Dennis shone his light upward, examining the wood, and that's when he stopped. He called Sarah over and pointed. There, carved into the surface of the beams, were marks, thin, shallow lines, clustered together in groups. Some of them were faint, barely visible. Others were deeper, gouged into the wood with enough force to splinter the grain. Dennis didn't say anything at first. He just kept moving the light, following the marks across the length of the beam. And then Sarah saw them clearly. They weren't random. They were scratch marks, small, frantic, made by fingernails. Sarah Klein couldn't sleep after they found the scratch marks. She lay awake in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image in her mind, those thin, desperate lines carved into the wooden beams, marks made by tiny fingers that had clawed at the only surface they could reach. She kept thinking about how small those hands must have been, how weak, how terrified. And she kept thinking about the fact that no one had heard them. No one had come. The church had stood there for over a century, and no one had ever asked what happened in that room. The next morning, she made a decision. She was going to find out exactly what Sister Margaretha Voss had done, no matter how long it took, no matter what she had to uncover. She started with the archives. There were other Lutheran parishes in the area, some of them even older than Street Judith's, and Sarah knew that churches often shared records, especially in the years before centralized diocesan filing systems. She contacted every parish within a 30-mile radius and asked if they had any correspondence, reports, or documents related to Sister Margaretha Voss or the nursery at Street Judith's. Most said no. A few didn't respond at all, but one, a small church in a town called Emmaus, said they had a box of old letters in their storage room, donated years ago by a former deaconess who had cleaned out the rectory. The pastor wasn't sure what was in the box, but Sarah was welcome to look. She drove to Emmaus the next day and spent 6 hours in a cold, windowless room going through the contents of that box. Most of it was mundane: thank you notes, financial records, copies of sermons. But near the bottom, folded inside an envelope addressed to a Reverend Friedrich Keller, she found a letter. It was dated April 1897, written in German, and signed by Sister Margaretha Voss. Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded it. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant, the letters formed with care. She took a photograph of each page, and later had it translated by a professor at Lehigh University. What she read made her feel sick. The letter was a response to Reverend Keller, who had apparently written to Sister Margaretha asking for advice on how to handle a similar situation in his own parish. A young woman who had given birth out of wedlock and wanted to leave the infant in the church's care. Sister Margaretha's reply was calm, measured, and chillingly methodical. She explained that she had been performing this work for over a decade, and that God had shown her a way to care for the children that honored both His will and the limitations of the church. She wrote that not all infants were meant to survive, that some were born weak, sickly, or cursed by the sins of their parents, and that it was the duty of the faithful to discern which children had the strength to live and which did not. She described a process she called returning them to God's breath. She did not use violence, she wrote. She did not use medicine or poison. She used time. Sister Margaretha explained that when an infant was brought to her, she would first baptize the child to ensure its soul would be saved. Then she would observe the child for signs of weakness, difficulty feeding, labored breathing, excessive crying, or a failure to thrive. If the child showed these signs, she would place it in a special room she had designed for this purpose. The room, she wrote, was small and dark, with limited airflow, and it allowed the child to make its own choice. If the child was strong, if God willed it to live, it would cry loudly enough to be heard. It would fight. It would endure. But if the child was weak, if it lacked the will to survive, it would simply stop. She wrote that the process usually took 3 to 7 days. The infants would cry at first, sometimes for hours, but eventually their voices would give out. Then they would grow quiet. Then they would sleep. And then, she wrote, they would return to God peacefully, without suffering, without violence, as if they had simply chosen not to wake. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she read those words. This wasn't madness. This wasn't rage or impulse. This was philosophy. Sister Margaretha had built a system. She had designed a room specifically for this purpose. She had convinced herself that what she was doing was not only moral but holy. She believed she was acting as an instrument of God, separating the worthy from the unworthy, the strong from the weak, and she believed that the infants who died in that room had made a choice, that their deaths were evidence of God's will. She was not a murderer in her own eyes. She was a servant, but there was more. Sarah kept digging, and 2 weeks later, in the archives of a parish in Allentown, she found a partial journal entry. It was a single page, torn from a larger book, dated November 1893. The handwriting matched Sister Margaretha's letters. The entry was brief, written in the same calm, measured tone, and it detailed the death of an infant boy she referred to only as M. She wrote that the child had been brought to her in late October, born to an unwed mother who could not care for him. She had baptized him on the day of his arrival and noted that he was small but otherwise healthy. She had placed him in the breathing room on November 2nd. For the first 2 days, she wrote, he cried almost constantly. On the 3rd day, his cries became weaker. On the 4th day, he was silent. On the 5th day, she opened the door and found him lying on his back, his eyes half open, his breathing shallow and slow. She wrote that she had knelt beside him and prayed, asking God to take him if that was his will. By the 6th day, he had stopped breathing entirely. She recorded the date as November 8th and referred to it as his day of silence. The journal entry ended with a single line that Sarah would never forget. Sister Margaretha wrote, "I feel no sorrow, only peace. He was not meant for this world, and now he rests in the arms of the Lord. I have done what was required of me." Sarah sat in the archive room for a long time after reading that, her hands pressed flat against the table, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She thought about the infants who had been placed in that room, one after another, for nearly 2 decades. She thought about how they must have felt in those first hours, confused, hungry, crying for warmth and comfort that never came. She thought about how the darkness must have surrounded them, how the air must have grown thin and stale, how their small bodies must have weakened day by day until they simply couldn't fight anymore. And she thought about Sister Margaretha, standing outside that locked door, listening to them cry, listening to them go silent, and feeling nothing but peace. This was not a crime of passion. This was not an accident. This was a ritual. Sister Margaretha Voss had convinced herself that she was not killing children, she was testing them. She was giving them a chance to prove their worth, their strength, their divine right to live. And when they failed, when they died in that small, dark room, she believed she had done them a kindness. She had baptized them. She had prayed for them. She had returned them to God. In her mind, she was not a monster. She was a saint. And that, Sarah realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. Because Sister Margaretha Voss had never once questioned whether what she was doing was wrong. She had never felt guilt. She had never hesitated. She had simply continued, year after year, child after child, convinced that she was performing an act of holy mercy, and the world had let her. There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself with violence or rage. It whispers, it negotiates, it shakes hands and signs documents and looks the other way. Sarah Klein had spent weeks uncovering the mechanics of Sister Margaretha's method, the cold logic that allowed her to kill without remorse. But the more she dug, the more she realized that Sister Margaretha had not operated alone. She had not hidden in the shadows. She had worked in plain sight, with the knowledge and cooperation of the very people who should have stopped her. The parents, the families, the town itself. They had known, or at least they had chosen not to ask. Sarah found the first piece of evidence in a leather-bound ledger tucked inside a filing cabinet at the Lehigh County Historical Society. The ledger had been donated in 1952 by the estate of a businessman named Otto Reinhardt, a wealthy German immigrant who had owned a textile mill in Allentown. The ledger contained financial records dating back to the 1880s payments to suppliers, employee wages, charitable donations. But buried in the pages marked 1887 to 1892, Sarah found a series of entries that made her pause. They were listed under miscellaneous donations, each one written in the same careful script. Donation to St. Judith's Nursery, care of Sister M. Voss. The amounts varied, but they were substantial. $20 here, $30 there, sometimes as much as $50. In total, Otto Reinhardt had donated over $300 to Sister Margaretha's nursery over the course of 5 years. That was a fortune in those days, far more than a simple act of charity would require. Sarah cross-referenced the dates of the donations with baptism records at St. Judith's, and a pattern emerged. In May 1887, a donation of $25 was made to the nursery. 2 weeks earlier, an infant girl had been baptized and recorded as a foundling, with no family name listed. In October 1889, another donation of $30. 3 weeks before that, another infant, this time a boy, baptized and labelled unnamed, ward of the parish. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Sarah requested access to the Reinhardt family papers, which were held in a private archive maintained by Otto's great-grandson, a retired accountant named Gerald Reinhardt. Gerald was reluctant at first, but when Sarah explained what she was researching, he agreed to let her look through the collection. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Among the family correspondence were letters between Otto Reinhardt and Sister Margaretha Voss, written in German, dating from 1886 to 1891. The letters were formal, polite, and utterly transactional. In one, dated March 1887, Otto wrote to Sister Margaretha informing her that a housemaid in his employ, a young woman named Clara, had become pregnant and would need to be dismissed. He asked if the nursery would be willing to accept the child once it was born. Sister Margaretha replied 2 weeks later, stating that she would be happy to care for the infant and that the matter would be handled with complete discretion. Otto's next letter, dated June 1887, thanked her for her service and included a donation of $25, which he described as a token of his gratitude for her continued faith in handling delicate family matters. There were 3 such exchanges in the Reinhardt correspondence. 3 infants, all born to different housemaids, all handed over to Sister Margaretha within days of their births. None of them appeared in any adoption records. None of them were ever mentioned again. And Otto Reinhardt, a pillar of the community, a man who attended church every Sunday and donated generously to every charitable cause in Lehigh County, had paid Sister Margaretha to make them disappear. He had known. He must have known, because after the 3rd child was taken to the nursery in 1891, Otto sent one final letter to Sister Margaretha. In it he wrote, "I trust that the child has been received into the care of the Church, and that this matter, like the others, will remain between us and God. Your work is a blessing to those of us who must navigate the complexities of maintaining a Christian household in an imperfect world." Sarah sat in Gerald Reinhardt's study, staring at that letter, and felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The language was so careful, so sanitized, so devoid of humanity. Otto Reinhardt had not asked what happened to the children. He had not asked if they were healthy, if they had been adopted, if they were alive. He had simply trusted that the matter would remain between them and God. And Sister Margaretha, in her replies, had never once assured him that the children were well. She had only thanked him for his donations and promised discretion. It was an agreement, a silent, unspoken agreement between 2 people who understood exactly what was happening and chose to call it something else. But Otto Reinhardt was not alone. Sarah found evidence of other families, other donors, other parents who had sent money to the nursery year after year with no expectation of transparency or accountability. One family, the Muellers, had donated $40 annually from 1888 to 1895, always marked as support for the foundlings. But when Sarah checked the adoption records for that period, she found no children adopted out to families named Mueller, no letters of gratitude, no updates on the children's well-being, just money, sent like clockwork, to a nursery that never released any of its charges. Another family, the Vogels, had written to Sister Margaretha in 1890 asking if she would accept their daughter's illegitimate child. The letter was stiff and formal, referring to the infant as the unfortunate result of youthful indiscretion. Sister Margaretha had replied that she would accept the child and that the family should have no further concern. The Vogels sent a donation of $60. The child was never heard from again. And then there were the mothers who came back. Sarah found a handwritten note, undated, tucked into one of Sister Margaretha's letters. It was written in broken English by a woman who signed her name only as E. The note was desperate, pleading. The woman wrote that she had left her baby at the nursery 6 months earlier and had not received any word about the child's condition. She asked if she could visit, if she could see her son, if she could know that he was safe. Sister Margaretha's reply, written in the margin of the same note, was brief and cold. She wrote, "The child is in God's care now. It is best that you do not inquire further. Trust in his will." Sarah traced the handwriting and eventually identified the woman as Elsa Hoffman, a seamstress who had lived in Bethlehem. Elsa had given birth to a son out of wedlock in 1892 and had brought him to Street, Judith's, when he was 3 weeks old. According to the baptism records, the boy had been named Johann, but there was no burial record for Johann, no adoption record, no further mention of him anywhere. Elsa had asked to see her son, and Sister Margaretha had told her to trust in God's will. And Elsa, like so many others, had stopped asking. She had gone back to her life, carrying the weight of not knowing, and she had never spoken of it again. This was the complicity that allowed Sister Margaretha to continue for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't just her faith, her method, her twisted conviction that she was doing God's work. It was the silence of everyone around her. The wealthy families who paid her to hide their shame. The mothers who were too afraid or too broken to demand answers. The town that looked the other way because the church was clean, the sermons were comforting, and Sister Margarethi's work kept the ugliness out of sight. No one wanted to know what happened behind that locked door. No one wanted to ask why so many babies were baptized but never buried, because asking would mean facing the truth. And the truth was that they had all agreed, in their silence, to let it happen. They had traded the lives of unwanted children for the preservation of their reputations, their comfort, their faith in a system that promised to take care of things quietly. And Sister Margaretha Voss, with her sad grey eyes and her soft voice, and her absolute certainty that she was serving God, had given them exactly what they wanted. She had made the problem disappear, and they had let her. Her name was Anna Bruckner, and she was 4 months old when they found her. She should have been dead. By every measure of Sister Margarethi's method, by the logic of the breathing room, by the slow and deliberate process of returning the weak to God's breath, Anna should not have survived. But she did, and what was left of her, what remained after those days in the darkness, was a kind of living evidence that would haunt everyone who ever saw her. She never spoke, she never looked at anyone's face. She lived for 45 years in an asylum, a ghost of a person, and when she died in 1934, no one came to her funeral. But her survival, brief and broken as it was, proved something that no one wanted to believe. The infants who died in that room did not go quietly. They did not simply fade away. They suffered, they fought, and some of them endured far longer than anyone should have had to endure. It was late September in 1889 when Reverend Thomas Ashford arrived at St. Judith's Lutheran Church. He was a senior minister from Philadelphia, sent by the diocesan office to discuss administrative matters with Father Ulrich, something to do with financial reporting and the consolidation of parish records. He had not announced his visit in advance, and when he arrived in the early afternoon, he found the church empty. Father Ulrich was not there. The sanctuary was quiet. Reverend Ashford walked through the building, calling out, looking for someone who could direct him to the priest's office. And that's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it. A soft, threadbare cry, barely more than a whimper, coming from somewhere in the back of the church. He followed the sound to a door marked with a small wooden sign that read nursery. The door was unlocked, and he stepped inside. The main room was tidy, almost sterile, with a few empty cribs lined up against the wall and shelves stacked with folded linens. But the crying was not coming from this room. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Reverend Ashford called out, asking if anyone was there, and that's when Sister Margarethi appeared. She stepped out from a side hallway, her grey dress immaculate, her face calm, and she asked him in her soft, accented voice what he needed. He told her he was looking for Father Ulrich, but before she could answer, the crying came again, louder this time, closer. Reverend Ashford asked her what that sound was, and Sister Margarethi told him it was nothing, just an infant who was fussy, who needed to rest. She said she would attend to it shortly, but Reverend Ashford did not move. He asked her to open the door. Sister Margarethe said there was no need, that the child was being cared for, that he should go wait in the sanctuary and Father Ulrich would return soon. Reverend Ashford asked again, and this time Sister Margaretha refused. He did not ask a third time. He walked past her, ignoring her protests, and followed the sound to a narrow door at the back of the nursery. The door was locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt. Sister Margaretha stepped in front of him and told him, her voice no longer soft but sharp and cold, that he had no right to enter that room, that it was a private space used for the care of special cases, that he needed to leave immediately. Reverend Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he grabbed the bolt and slid it open. Sister Margaretha did not move. She simply stood there, her hands folded, her face expressionless, as he pulled the door wide and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. It was the smell of human waste, of sour milk, of something rotting. The room was small, no more than 9 feet by 12, with no windows and no source of light except for the dim glow coming from the doorway behind him. The air was thick and stale, and he could feel it pressing against his lungs as he breathed. And there, in the center of the room, lying on a thin, soiled blanket, was a baby. A girl. She was so small, so thin, that at first Reverend Ashford thought she was already dead. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over her ribs and the bones of her skull. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, staring at nothing. Her mouth was slightly parted, and her breathing was so shallow he had to kneel beside her to see if her chest was moving at all. There was a small tin dish near her head, filled with water that had gone stagnant. There were no blankets, except for the one she lay on. No toys, no cradle. Just the bare wooden floor and the walls and the suffocating darkness. Reverend Ashford picked her up, and the baby did not react. She did not cry. She did not open her eyes fully. She was limp in his arms, her head lolling to the side, her body so light it felt like he was holding something hollow. He turned and walked out of the room, past Sister Margarethi, who said nothing, who did not try to stop him, who simply watched him leave with that same calm, unreadable expression. He carried the baby out of the nursery, out of the church, and directly to his carriage. He drove her to the nearest hospital, a small facility in Allentown, and when the doctors saw her, they did not ask questions. They simply took her from his arms and began to work. The baby survived. Against every expectation, against the damage that had already been done to her small, fragile body, she survived. The doctors said she was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from what they called failure to thrive. They estimated she had been in that room for at least 5 days, possibly longer. Her muscles were atrophied, her reflexes were delayed, and there was something else. Something the doctors could not quantify but that they noted in their reports. The child did not respond to stimulation. She did not cry when touched. She did not track movement with her eyes. She did not reach for comfort. It was as if something inside her had already shut down, as if the part of her brain that connected her to the world had been damaged beyond repair. They named her Anna, after the nurse who cared for her in those first critical weeks. Her last name, Bruckner, was taken from the hospital records. She had been brought in as an unnamed foundling, and the name was assigned to her for administrative purposes. When she was strong enough to leave the hospital, there was nowhere for her to go. No family came forward to claim her. No one knew who her mother was. Reverend Ashford made inquiries, but Sister Margarethi refused to provide any information, and Father Ulrich, when questioned, said only that the church had taken in many children over the years and that records were not always complete. The matter was quietly dropped. Anna was placed in the care of the Allentown County Asylum for the Feeble-Minded, an institution that housed children and adults with developmental disabilities, and that is where she spent the rest of her life. Anna never learned to speak. She never made eye contact. She never showed any sign of recognizing the people around her or understanding where she was. The asylum staff described her as docile, passive, unresponsive. She would sit for hours without moving, staring at the wall, her hands folded in her lap. She did not play. She did not interact with the other children. She did not smile. The doctors who examined her over the years noted that her cognitive development had been severely stunted, likely due to prolonged oxygen deprivation and extreme neglect during a critical period of brain development. They believed that whatever had happened to her in those first months of life had caused permanent neurological damage. She would never recover. She would never be whole. Anna Bruckner lived in that asylum for 45 years. She grew into a woman, physically, but mentally she remained frozen, trapped in the same unreachable state she had been in since she was found. She died in 1934, at the age of 45, from pneumonia. There was no funeral. No one claimed her body. She was buried in the asylum's pauper cemetery, in an unmarked grave, alongside dozens of others who had lived and died without names, without families, without anyone to remember them. But Anna's story, as tragic as it was, proved something that no record or letter or journal entry ever could. She proved that the breathing room was not a place of mercy. It was not a place where children peacefully chose to return to God. It was a place of slow, deliberate torture. Anna had been in that room for days, possibly a week, lying in her own waste, breathing stale air, crying until her voice gave out, and no one had come. She had survived only because a stranger had broken down the door, and the fact that she survived at all meant that others had endured the same thing. They had lain in that darkness, alone, starving, gasping for air, crying for help that never came, and they had not died quickly. They had died slowly, over days, over a week, until their small bodies simply could not fight anymore. Anna was proof, and she would carry that proof in her broken, silent body until the day she died. Reverend Thomas Ashford did everything he was supposed to do. He filed a formal complaint with the Lutheran Synod office in Philadelphia within days of finding Anna Bruckner in that locked room. He wrote a detailed account of what he had witnessed, the condition of the child, the smell of the room, the refusal of Sister Margaretha to allow him entry, the lack of proper care or supervision. He included a letter from the attending physician at Allentown Hospital, documenting Anna's severe malnutrition and the likelihood that she had been neglected for an extended period. He requested an immediate investigation into the operations of the nursery at St. Judith's Lutheran Church and a full accounting of all children who had been placed in Sister Margaretha's care. He expected action. He expected outrage. He expected the church to do what was right. But this was 1889. The church had influence. And what Reverend Ashford did not yet understand was that institutions do not protect truth. They protect themselves. The Synod opened an internal investigation in October of that year. A committee was formed, composed of 3 senior ministers and a diocesan secretary. They traveled to Lehigh County and met with Father Ulrich, who assured them that the situation had been tragically misunderstood. He explained that Sister Margaretha Voss was a woman of deep faith who had devoted her life to caring for the most vulnerable members of their community. He said that the child Reverend Ashford had found was indeed in her care, but that the child had been sickly from birth, and Sister Margaretha had been doing her best to nurse her back to health in a quiet, controlled environment. He said that the room Reverend Ashford had described as a prison was simply a space used for isolating infants who were ill to prevent the spread of disease to other children in the nursery. He said that Reverend Ashford, though well-meaning, had misinterpreted what he saw. The committee listened. They took notes. They did not ask to see the room. They did not ask to speak with Sister Margaretha directly. They did not request access to the nursery's records or ask how many other children had been isolated in that same room. They simply thanked Father Ulrich for his time and returned to Philadelphia. Their report, issued in November 1889, concluded that while certain aspects of the nursery's operations may have been insufficient by modern standards, there was no evidence of intentional wrongdoing or criminal neglect. The report acknowledged that the discovery of the child in a distressed state was concerning, but it attributed this to a lack of resources and the overwhelming demands placed on Sister Margaretha, who had been caring for numerous foundlings with little assistance. The committee recommended that the nursery be subject to periodic inspections going forward, and that Sister Margaretha receive additional training in infant care practices. But no charges were filed, no formal rebuke was issued, and no one was held accountable. Reverend Ashford was furious. He wrote letters to the synod, to the diocesan office, to anyone who would listen. He argued that the committee had conducted a sham investigation, that they had taken Father Ulrich's word without question, that they had ignored the evidence of systematic neglect and possible abuse. He demanded that the matter be escalated to civil authorities, that the local sheriff be notified, that a criminal investigation be opened. But his letters went unanswered, and when he pressed the issue further, he was quietly told by a senior church official that his continued involvement in the matter was becoming a distraction, that the church had handled the situation appropriately, and that it would be best for everyone if he allowed the matter to rest. The message was clear. If he continued to push, his own career would suffer, so Reverend Ashford stopped pushing. He returned to Philadelphia, and he never spoke of Anna Bruckner again. In December 1889, Sister Margaretha Voss was removed from her position at St. Judith's. There was no public announcement, no explanation given to the congregation. She simply disappeared one morning, and by the end of the week, the nursery was closed. The church told anyone who asked that Sister Margaretha had been reassigned to another mission, that her work in Lehigh County had been completed, and that the nursery would no longer be accepting new children. A few families inquired about the infants who had been in her care, but they were told that the children had been transferred to other institutions or placed with families in distant counties. No names were provided, no records were made available, and within a matter of weeks, people stopped asking. Sister Margaretha was sent to a small rural convent in southern Ohio, a place so isolated that it didn't even have a proper mailing address. She lived there for the next 24 years, in silence and seclusion, performing menial tasks and attending daily prayers. She never returned to Pennsylvania. She never worked with children again, and when she died in 1913, at the age of 65, the obituary published by the convent described her as a faithful servant of God who had dedicated her life to the care of the poor and the forgotten. There was no mention of Street Judiths, no mention of the nursery, no mention of the children. She was buried in the convent cemetery, and her grave was marked with a simple wooden cross. No one came to mourn her. Father Ulrich, who had overseen Sister Margarethi's work for 7 years, who had praised her in his sermons and supported her efforts without question, was reassigned to a parish in rural Michigan in the spring of 1890. The synod said it was a routine transfer, part of a broader reorganization of clergy assignments, but those who knew the situation understood what it really was. It was a quiet removal, a way to distance the church from the scandal without admitting that a scandal had occurred. Father Ulrich served in Michigan for another 12 years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about his time at Street Judiths. He never acknowledged the nursery. He never mentioned Sister Margarethe, and when he died in 1903, his obituary praised him as a devoted pastor who had served his congregations with humility and grace. The official position of the Lutheran Church, as stated in internal correspondence from 1890, was that the situation at Street Judiths had been the result of misunderstandings and grief, and that the claims made by Reverend Ashford were unsubstantiated. The Church maintained that no evidence of wrongdoing had been found, and that the matter had been resolved through appropriate administrative actions. And to ensure that no further questions could be raised, the Church took one final step. In the summer of 1891, a fire broke out in the cellar of Street Judith's Lutheran Church. The cause was listed as accidental, the result of an oil lamp that had been left unattended. The fire destroyed most of the basement storage area, including several wooden cabinets that contained parish records. Among the records lost were the baptism logs dating from 1883 to 1889, the nursery intake forms, and all correspondence related to Sister Margarethi's work. By the time the fire was extinguished, there was almost nothing left, a few charred pages, a handful of receipts, but the names of the children, the dates they had been brought to the nursery, the records of who had given them up, and why all of it was gone. The fire was investigated by the local fire marshal, who concluded that it had been an unfortunate accident. No one questioned the timing, no one suggested that it might have been deliberate, and within a few months, the incident was forgotten. The church rebuilt the cellar, installed new storage cabinets, and continued as it always had. Services were held every Sunday. Sermons were preached, hymns were sung, and the town of Lehigh County moved on, as towns always do, because moving on is easier than facing the truth. Sister Margarethe Voss had been removed, the nursery had been closed, the records had been destroyed, and the children who had died in that small, dark room were erased from history, as if they had never existed at all. This was not justice. This was not accountability. This was institutional protection. Evil shielded by reputation, by influence, by the quiet agreement of people who valued order more than truth. And it worked. For over a century, it worked. Edward Lott was 62 years old in the spring of 1924, and he had worked as a groundskeeper at Street Judith's Lutheran Church for nearly 30 years. He knew every inch of that property, the trees that needed trimming, the stones in the walkway that had come loose, the places where the ground settled after heavy rain. He was a quiet man, a widower with no children, and he took pride in his work. He kept the grass cut, the gardens weeded, the cemetery neat and orderly. He had buried parishioners, cleared snow from the steps in winter, repaired the roof when it leaked. He had never asked questions. He had never caused trouble, and he had never expected to find what he found that day. The church board had decided that the old septic system needed to be expanded. The congregation had grown slightly in recent years, and the existing system, installed in the 1890s, was no longer sufficient. They hired a contractor to design the new layout, and Edward was tasked with digging the trench for the new septic line. It was hard work, especially for a man his age, but he didn't complain. He marked out the path with stakes and string, just as the contractor had instructed, and began to dig. The trench ran along the eastern side of the church, roughly 30 feet from where the old nursery wing had once stood. The nursery had been demolished years earlier, in 1903, after it had fallen into disrepair. All that remained was the foundation, barely visible beneath the overgrown grass. Edward had been digging for about an hour when his shovel hit something that didn't feel like dirt. It was softer, more yielding, and when he pulled the shovel back, he saw fabric. Old fabric, rotted and stained, clinging to something beneath the soil. He knelt down and brushed the dirt away with his hands, and that's when he saw it. Bones. Small bones, white and brittle, no longer than his hand. He sat back on his heels, his heart pounding, and stared at what he had uncovered. It was a bundle, wrapped in what had once been linen or cotton, now decayed almost to nothing. And inside the bundle were the remains of an infant. Edward didn't move for a long time. He just knelt there in the dirt, staring, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. He had buried people before. He had dug graves, lowered coffins, covered them with soil. But this was different. This was not a grave. This was a shallow pit, no more than 2 feet deep, unmarked and forgotten. He looked around, scanning the area, and that's when he noticed something else. The ground nearby was uneven, slightly sunken in places, as if it had been disturbed and then left to settle. He stood up, took his shovel, and began to dig again. About 5 feet to the left, he found another bundle. This one was smaller, wrapped in what looked like burlap. Inside were more bones, tiny ribs, a fragile skull. He kept digging. By the time the sun began to set, Edward had found 17 bundles. Some were wrapped in cloth, others in wicker baskets that had rotted through. A few were so deteriorated that the bones had scattered, mixed with the soil, almost impossible to distinguish. None of them were in coffins. None of them had markers. None of them had been buried with any kind of ceremony or care. They were just there, hidden in the ground, 30 feet from where the church nursery had once stood. Edward sat on the edge of the trench, his hands shaking, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know who to tell. So he did what he had always done. He went to the church board. The board met with him the next morning in the church office. There were 3 men present, 2 deacons and the current pastor, a man named Reverend Muller, who had only been at St. Judith's for a few years. Edward told them what he had found. He described the bundles, the bones, the shallow graves. He said he didn't know what they were or how they had gotten there, but he thought someone should be notified. The police, maybe, or the county coroner. Reverend Muller listened without interrupting, his face pale, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. When Edward finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that what Edward had found was likely an old pauper's field, a place where the church had buried the indigent and the unnamed in the years before proper cemetery plots were established. He said it was not uncommon for churches to have such areas, especially in rural communities where resources were limited. He said the remains were probably very old, and that disturbing them further would serve no purpose. Edward asked if they should at least document what he had found, maybe mark the area, maybe say a prayer. Reverend Muller shook his head. He said that the best course of action was to rebury the remains respectfully and leave them undisturbed. He said that bringing attention to the matter would only cause confusion and distress among the congregation, especially for families who might wonder if their own ancestors had been buried in unmarked graves. He said it was a matter of compassion, of letting the dead rest in peace. And then he said something that Edward would never forget. He said that Edward should not speak of this to anyone, not to his neighbors, not to his friends, not to anyone outside that room. He said it was a private matter, a matter of church business, and that it would be handled appropriately. Edward wanted to argue. He wanted to say that 17 infant bodies buried in shallow graves was not church business, that it was something else, something wrong. But he didn't. He nodded. He said he understood, and he left. Edward spent the next 2 days reburying the remains. He did it alone, without help, without ceremony. He wrapped each bundle as carefully as he could, said a quiet prayer over each one, and placed them back in the ground. He filled in the trench, smoothed the soil, and planted grass seed over the area. And when he was finished, he went home and sat at his kitchen table and tried to forget what he had seen. But he couldn't forget. So he did something that he never told anyone about, not for years. He drew a map. It was crude, sketched on a piece of paper torn from a notebook, but it was accurate. He marked the location of each bundle he had found, numbering them 1 through 17, noting their approximate depth and the condition of the wrapping. He folded the map and put it in an envelope, and he hid it in the back of a drawer in his bedroom. He told himself he was keeping it in case someone ever asked, in case the truth ever mattered. But no one ever asked. And the truth stayed buried. Edward Lott died in 1947, at the age of 85. He never spoke of the graves again. But before he died, he told his daughter about the map. He didn't explain why he had drawn it or what it meant, but he told her where it was and said that if anyone ever came looking for the truth about Street Judiths, she should give it to them. His daughter didn't understand. She put the map in a box with the rest of her father's belongings and forgot about it. Years later, when she passed away, the box went to her son, Edward's grandson, a man named Paul Lott. Paul kept the box in his attic for decades, never looking through it, never thinking about it. And then, in 2019, Sarah Klein called him. Sarah had found Paul's name in a genealogy forum where someone had mentioned that his grandfather had worked at Street Judiths in the 1920s. She reached out, asking if he knew anything about the church's history, about the nursery, about any unusual events that might have occurred. Paul didn't know much, but he remembered the box. He went up to his attic, opened it, and found the map. He didn't know what it was at first, but when he looked closely, when he saw the numbers, the notes, the carefully drawn lines indicating where each bundle had been found, he understood. He called Sarah back and told her he had something she needed to see. He mailed her the map the next day. When Sarah unfolded that piece of paper and saw what Edward Lott had documented, she felt her hands go numb. 17 graves, 17 infants, buried without names, without markers, without acknowledgement. And this was just what one man had found in a single afternoon, in a single trench, in a single section of the church grounds. How many more were there? How many bodies were still buried beneath that grass, beneath the trees, beneath the gardens that parishioners walked through every Sunday? The scope of what Sister Margarethy had done, the sheer number of lives she had taken, became undeniable in that moment. This was not a mistake. This was not an isolated incident. This was systematic. This was sustained. This was evil carried out methodically, deliberately, over years, and then buried and forgotten. And the church had known. They had known in 1924, and they had chosen to cover it up. They had told Edward Lott to rebury the bodies and never speak again. And he had obeyed, because that's what people did. They obeyed. They stayed silent, and the children stayed in the ground, unclaimed and unnamed, for nearly 100 years. Sarah Klein spent 3 years fighting for the right to dig up the ground at Street Judith's Lutheran Church. 3 years of phone calls, letters, meetings with lawyers, petitions filed with the county, appeals to historical societies, and endless arguments with people who did not want the past disturbed. The church resisted from the very beginning. The current pastor, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Dietrich, told Sarah that exhuming the area would be disrespectful to the memory of those who were buried there, that it would cause unnecessary pain to the congregation, and that the church had already acknowledged the tragedy and moved forward. The church board echoed his sentiments, arguing that whatever had happened a century ago was not the responsibility of the current generation, and that reopening old wounds served no productive purpose. The county was no more helpful. Officials from the planning department, the historical preservation office, and the district attorney's office all told Sarah the same thing. Without concrete evidence of a crime, without proof that the remains were the result of criminal activity rather than unfortunate circumstances, there was no legal basis for authorizing an exhumation. But Sarah had evidence. She had Edward Lott's map, which documented the exact locations of 17 infant burials. She had the architectural blueprints showing the breathing room, a windowless space with no clear purpose other than isolation. She had Sister Margarethy's letters, including the one where she described her method of returning children to God's breath. She had the journal entry where she recorded the death of an infant she had placed in that room for 6 days. She had the medical records of Anna Bruckner, the only child known to have survived the breathing room, whose neurological damage was consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation and severe neglect. And she had the testimony of historians, forensic experts, and child welfare advocates who reviewed her findings and concluded that the evidence strongly suggested systematic infanticide carried out over a period of nearly 2 decades. Sarah compiled all of this into a formal petition and filed it with the Lehigh County Court of Common Pleas in the fall of 2021, requesting a court order to authorize the exhumation and forensic examination of the area identified on Edward Lott's map. The church fought the petition. They hired their own lawyers, who argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the map was unreliable, that the letters and journal entries were being taken out of context, and that Anna Bruckner's condition could have been caused by any number of factors unrelated to Sister Margarethi's care. They argued that exhuming the remains would constitute a violation of religious sanctity, and that the church had the right to protect its grounds from invasive investigation. The county joined the church's opposition, citing concerns about the cost of the exhumation, the potential for contamination of evidence, and the possibility that the remains were simply part of an old, unmarked cemetery that had been lost to time. But Sarah had anticipated all of this. She brought in 2 lawyers who specialized in historical justice cases, attorneys who had worked on exhumations related to unmarked graves at reform schools, asylums, and other institutions where vulnerable populations had been systematically abused. They argued that the evidence was not circumstantial, that it was overwhelming, and that the public had a right to know what had happened on church property. They argued that the remains were not simply the result of unfortunate deaths, but the result of deliberate actions that constituted criminal neglect at a minimum and likely met the legal definition of homicide. And they argued that the families of the victims' descendants who might still be alive, who might still be searching for answers about relatives who had disappeared into Sister Margarethi's care, deserved closure. The case went before Judge Marion Haskell in January 2022. Judge Haskell reviewed the evidence, heard arguments from both sides, and took 2 weeks to deliberate. When she issued her ruling, she stated that while the events in question had occurred over a century ago and were therefore beyond the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution, the evidence presented by Sarah Klein was sufficient to justify a court-ordered exhumation on the grounds of historical and genealogical research. She noted that the map, the letters, the architectural plans, and the medical records collectively painted a picture of systematic abuse that warranted further investigation. She ordered the church to allow access to the area marked on Edward Lott's map and authorized the county to contract with a team of forensic archaeologists to conduct the exhumation under controlled conditions. The church was given 30 days to comply. They did not appeal. The excavation began in March 2022. A team of forensic archaeologists from Temple University, led by Dr. Evelyn Marsh, arrived at St. Judith's with ground-penetrating radar, excavation tools, and a mobile lab for on-site analysis. They marked off the area indicated on Edward Lott's map, a section of land roughly 40 feet by 30 feet, located on the eastern side of the church where the nursery wing had once stood. The radar scans revealed multiple anomalies beneath the surface disturbances in the soil, consistent with burial sites, clustered together in a pattern that did not match the layout of the church's official cemetery. Dr. Marsh and her team began to dig carefully, layer by layer, documenting every step with photographs and detailed notes. Within the first week, they found the first remains, a small bundle, wrapped in rotted fabric, buried less than 2 feet below the surface. Inside were the bones of an infant, no more than a few months old. The team continued digging. By the end of the first month, they had found 63 sets of remains, 63 infants, buried in shallow, unmarked graves, scattered across the excavation site. Some were wrapped in cloth or burlap. Others were placed in small wicker baskets that had long since disintegrated. A few were laid directly in the soil, with nothing to protect them. None of them were in coffins. None of them had headstones or markers of any kind. The remains were carefully exhumed, catalogued, and transported to the university lab for analysis. Dr. Marsh worked with a team of forensic anthropologists, pathologists, and DNA specialists to examine each set of bones. They used carbon dating to confirm the age of the remains, and the results were consistent with burials from the 1880s through the early 1900s. They measured the bones, analyzed their condition, and looked for signs of trauma or disease. What they found was heartbreaking. Many of the skeletons showed signs of severe malnutrition. The bones were thin, underdeveloped, with evidence of stunted growth that indicated the infants had not been receiving adequate nutrition in the weeks or months before their deaths. Some of the remains showed skeletal stress markers consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation changes in the bone structure that occur when a body is subjected to sustained periods of inadequate airflow. Dr. Marsh explained to Sarah that these markers were rare, typically seen only in cases of chronic respiratory distress or conditions where an infant had been deprived of proper ventilation over an extended period of time. None of the remains showed signs of violent trauma. There were no broken bones, no signs of blunt force, no evidence of stabbing or strangulation. The infants had not been killed quickly. They had not been murdered in the way most people think of murder. They had been left to die, slowly, over days. Dr. Marsh said it plainly in her preliminary report. These babies didn't die quickly. They faded. The team extracted DNA from the remains wherever possible, focusing on teeth and bone marrow, which tend to preserve genetic material better than other tissues. Out of the 63 sets of remains, they were able to recover usable DNA from 41. The DNA was entered into genealogical databases, and within months, descendant matches began to appear. Some were distant fourth or fifth cousins who shared a common ancestor from the 1800s, but others were closer. Direct descendants, great-great-grandchildren of women who had given birth in the 1880s and 1890s and had brought their infants to St. Judith's, trusting that the church would care for them. These families had never known what happened. They had been told that the children had been adopted, or that they had died of illness, or simply that they had been sent away. Now, more than a century later, they were learning the truth. They were learning that their relatives had not been adopted. They had not died of natural causes. They had been placed in a room and left to suffocate. They had been buried in unmarked graves and forgotten. One woman, a descendant of Elsa Hoffman, the seamstress who had written to Sister Marguerite asking to see her son, was contacted by the DNA match service in the summer of 2022. Her name was Rebecca Stern, and she had been researching her family tree for years, trying to find out what had happened to a great-great-uncle named Johann, who had disappeared from all records after 1892. When she received the notification that her DNA-matched remains recovered from St. Judith's, she called Sarah Klein immediately. Sarah told her the whole story about the nursery, about Sister Margarethe, about the breathing room, about the 63 infants who had been found. Rebecca listened in silence, and when Sarah finished, she said only one thing. She said, "So they just threw him away." And Sarah, who had spent 3 years uncovering this horror, who had fought through every obstacle to bring these children out of the ground, could only answer, "Yes, they threw him away, and then they buried the evidence, and then they forgot. But now, finally, the world would know. The children had been found, and their names, wherever possible, would be spoken aloud again." After the exhumation was completed and the remains had been removed for analysis, the church board made a decision that surprised almost everyone. They agreed to demolish what remained of the old nursery wing. The structure had been partially torn down in 1903, but the foundation and some of the interior walls had been left standing, eventually incorporated into a storage shed that had been built over the site in the 1950s. The shed was old, crumbling, and had not been used in years. The board said that demolishing it was part of an effort to move forward, to acknowledge the past and create space for healing. But Sarah Klein suspected the real reason was simpler. They wanted to erase what was left. They wanted to tear down the last physical remnant of Sister Margarethe's work so that no one could stand in that space and imagine what had happened there. The demolition was scheduled for August 2022, and Sarah made sure she was there to witness it. The crew arrived early on a Saturday morning with a small excavator and hand tools. The shed was not large, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, with rotting wooden walls and a rusted metal roof. Beneath it, visible once the floor was pulled up, were the old stone and mortar foundations of the original nursery. The workers began carefully dismantling the structure, removing the roof first, then the outer walls, then the interior partitions. Sarah stood at a distance, watching, taking photographs, making notes. She didn't know what she expected to find. The ground had already been excavated. The bodies had already been removed, but something kept her there, some instinct that told her the story was not finished yet. It was just after noon when one of the workers called out. He had been prying apart a section of interior wall when he noticed something unusual. The wall was thicker than it should have been, and when he tapped it with a hammer, it sounded hollow. He used a crowbar to break through the plaster and lath. and inside the hollow space, wedged between the studs, was a metal box. It was small, roughly the size of a shoebox, made of tin that had rusted at the edges but was otherwise intact. The box was sealed with a simple latch, and when the worker opened it, he found a single object inside, a letter, folded in thirds, written on yellowed paper in fading ink. He handed it to Sarah without reading it. She unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling, and saw immediately that it was written in German. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful script, was a signature, Margaret Voss. The date at the top read the 12th of March 1901. Sarah took the letter to a translator that same afternoon, a professor of German language and literature at Lehigh University. She asked him to translate it word for word, to preserve every nuance, every phrase, every detail. He worked on it for 2 days, cross-referencing old dictionaries to ensure the translation was accurate, and when he handed her the English version, he told her that he had never read anything quite like it. He said it was written with the clarity and calm of someone explaining a recipe or describing a garden. There was no emotion in it, no hesitation, no doubt. It was, he said, the most disturbing document he had ever encountered. The letter began with a simple statement. I write this so that those who come after me will understand the work I have done, and so that God will know that I have served him faithfully. Sister Margarethe explained that she had devoted her life to the care of children, but that she had come to realize, through prayer and observation, that not all children were meant to live. She wrote that the world was full of weakness, of sickness, of sin, and that many infants were born carrying the burdens of their parents' failures. She wrote that it was not cruel to recognize this truth, but compassionate. She wrote that God had given her a gift, the ability to see which children had the strength to survive and which did not. And she wrote that she had built the breathing room as a way to allow God's will to manifest. She described the room in detail. She wrote that it was small and dark, with limited airflow, and that it was designed to create an environment where only the strongest infants could endure. She called it a test of divine will. She wrote that when she placed a child in that room, she was not killing it, she was giving it a chance to prove its worth. If the child cried loudly, if it fought, if it survived the days of isolation and deprivation, then it was clear that God intended for it to live. But if the child grew weak, if it stopped crying, if it faded into silence, then that was God's answer. That child was not meant for this world. She wrote that she had prayed over each one, that she had baptized them all, and that she felt no sorrow when they died. She felt only peace. She felt pride, even because she believed she was doing what God required of her. She was culling the weak so that only the strong would carry forward his creation. And then, at the end of the letter, Sister Margarethe included a list. She wrote that she wanted to record the names of the children she had returned to God so that their souls would not be forgotten, so that they would be remembered as part of her holy work. The list was written in 2 columns, each entry containing a first name, a date, and sometimes a brief note, sickly, unwanted, born of sin. Sarah counted the names slowly, her hands shaking, her vision blurring. There were 89 names on that list. 89 infants who had been placed in the breathing room and had not survived. 89 children who had died under Sister Margarethe's care, deliberately, methodically, over the course of 18 years, and only 63 sets of remains had been found. Sarah sat in her hotel room that night, staring at the translated letter, trying to comprehend what it meant. 89 names, 63 bodies. That left 26 children unaccounted for. 26 infants who had been killed by Sister Margarethe, but whose remains had not been buried in the area mapped by Edward Lott. Where were they? Had they been buried somewhere else on the church property? Had they been disposed of in a different way? Had they been taken to another location entirely? Sarah didn't know. But what she did know, what the letter made horrifyingly clear, was that the exhumation had not found everyone. There were still more bodies. Somewhere. The letter also revealed something else, something that Sarah found almost as disturbing as the list of names. Sister Margarethe had felt no guilt. She had not written this letter as a confession in the traditional sense, as an admission of wrongdoing or a plea for forgiveness. She had written it as a record of accomplishment. She had written it to justify herself, to explain her actions, to ensure that future generations would understand that what she had done was not evil but righteous. She had believed, with absolute certainty, that she was serving God. She had believed that the children who died in that room had been tested and found wanting, and that their deaths were not tragedies but necessary outcomes. She had felt peace. She had felt pride, and she had hidden this letter in the wall, sealed it in a box, and left it there for someone to find, as if it were a testament to her faith. Sarah thought about the psychology of that. She thought about what it meant to kill 89 children and feel no remorse. She thought about the kind of mind that could construct an entire moral framework to justify that kind of violence, that could convince itself that suffocating infants in a dark room was an act of divine service. This was not insanity in the conventional sense. Sister Margarethe had not been delusional. She had not been driven by rage or impulse. She had been calm, rational, methodical. She had designed a system. She had kept records. She had operated within the structure of the church, with the implicit approval of the community, for nearly 2 decades. And she had done it all while believing that she was one of the righteous, one of the faithful, one of the chosen instruments of God's will. That was the true horror. Not that she had killed, but that she had killed without ever questioning whether it was wrong. She had never hesitated. She had never doubted. She had simply continued, year after year, child after child, convinced that she was doing what needed to be done. The letter was entered into evidence as part of the ongoing investigation, and copies were provided to the families of the identified victims. Some families were devastated to see their ancestors' names on that list, to know with certainty that their great-great-grandparents had been murdered. Others were relieved, in a strange way, to finally have answers, to know what had happened to relatives who had vanished without explanation over a century ago. But for Sarah, the letter raised a new and terrible question. If there were 89 names and only 63 bodies, where were the others? She requested permission to expand the search area, to use ground-penetrating radar on other sections of the church property, to look for additional burial sites. The church resisted, but Judge Haskell granted the request, and in the fall of 2022, a second round of excavations began. And as the team prepared to dig again, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Sister Margarethe's final words in that letter. She had written, "I have done what was required of me, and I leave this record so that the faithful will know. The work is complete." But the work was not complete, because 26 children were still missing, and somewhere, beneath the ground or hidden in some place no one had thought to look, they were waiting to be found. In January 2023, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America issued a formal apology for the events that had occurred at St. Judith's Lutheran Church between 1883 and 1901. The apology was read aloud during a special service held at the church, attended by fewer than 50 people, and later published on the denomination's official website. The statement acknowledged that Sister Margarethe Voss had operated under the authority of the church, that her actions had resulted in the deaths of at least 63 infants, and that the church's failure to investigate or intervene had enabled those deaths to continue for nearly 2 decades. The apology expressed deep sorrow for the suffering of the children and their families, and it committed the church to ensuring that such abuses would never happen again. The statement was careful, legalistic, and emotionally distant. It said all the right things, but it felt hollow, because an apology, no matter how carefully worded, could not undo what had been done. It could not bring back the children who had died in that small, dark room. It could not erase the fact that the church had known, or should have known, and had chosen to look away. As part of the apology, the church announced the creation of a memorial garden on the site where the 63 sets of remains had been exhumed. The garden was designed by a landscape architect from Philadelphia and included a stone pathway, benches for quiet reflection, and a central memorial wall inscribed with the names of the identified victims. Each child was also given an individual headstone, small and simple, made of grey granite. Where names had been recovered from Sister Margarethe's list or through DNA analysis, those names were engraved on the stones. Where names could not be determined, the stones were marked simply as unknown child, followed by a number corresponding to the order in which the remains had been discovered. The garden was dedicated in April 2023, and Sarah Klein was invited to speak at the ceremony. She stood in front of a small crowd, mostly descendants of the victims, a few journalists, a handful of church members, and she talked about the importance of remembering, of speaking the names of those who had been erased, of refusing to let their deaths be forgotten. She said that the children buried in that garden had been invisible in life, and that the least the world could do was make them visible in death. When she finished, she walked along the rows of headstones, reading each name aloud. It took nearly 10 minutes, and when she was done, the silence that followed felt heavy, like the weight of a century pressing down on the ground. But the memorial garden did not bring peace. It brought division. The town of Lehigh County, which had largely ignored the investigation while it was happening, suddenly had to confront the reality of what had occurred in their community. Some residents embraced the truth. They attended the dedication ceremony. They donated money to maintain the garden. They spoke openly about the need to acknowledge the past and learn from it. But others reacted with anger and denial. They said that Sarah Klein had exaggerated the evidence, that the church was being unfairly attacked, that the whole thing was a media-driven scandal designed to make religious institutions look bad. A few insisted that the remains could have been from a pauper's cemetery or a plague burial site, that there was no proof Sister Margarethi had actually killed anyone, and that the so-called confession found in the wall was a forgery. These people wrote letters to the local newspaper, posted on social media, showed up at church board meetings to argue that the apology had been a mistake. They said the church should never have cooperated with the investigation. They said the past should have been left buried. The congregation at St. Judith suffered the most. Before the exhumation, the church had roughly 100 active members, mostly older adults who had attended for decades. By the end of 2023, that number had dropped to fewer than 40. Some members left because they were ashamed to be associated with a church that had enabled such horror. Others left because they felt the church had betrayed its history by apologizing, by admitting fault, by allowing outsiders to dig up the past. Sunday services, which had once been filled with hymns and fellowship, became quiet and strained. Reverend Dietrich, who had initially resisted the exhumation, resigned in the summer of 2023, citing health reasons. He was replaced by a younger pastor who tried to rebuild the congregation, but it was difficult. The church was no longer just a place of worship. It was a crime scene. It was a memorial, and no matter how many flowers were planted in that garden, no matter how many prayers were said, the shadow of what had happened there would not lift. Sarah Klein published her research as a book in the fall of 2023. It was titled The Breathing Room, Sister Margaret Voss and the Children of St. Judith's. The book was meticulously researched, drawing on the letters, journal entries, architectural plans, court documents, forensic reports, and interviews with descendants that Sarah had compiled over 4 years. It was not a sensationalized account. It was sober, factual, and devastating. The book received widespread attention, covered by national news outlets, reviewed in major publications, and discussed on podcasts and documentaries. But the response was polarized. Some readers praised Sarah for her courage in uncovering the truth, for giving voice to the voiceless, for holding institutions accountable. But others attacked her. She received hate mail, dozens of letters accusing her of being anti-Christian, of fabricating evidence, of exploiting tragedy for profit. Some of the letters were vicious, calling her names, threatening her reputation, telling her she would burn in hell for defaming a woman of God. Sarah kept the letters in a box in her office, not because she wanted to read them again, but because she wanted to remember that telling the truth was not always welcomed, that some people would rather protect their faith, their institutions, their sense of order, than face the reality of what those institutions had done. But Sarah also received other letters. Letters from researchers, historians, genealogists, and descendants who had read her book and recognized patterns in their own family histories. A woman in Ohio wrote to say that her great-grandmother had given birth to twins in 1895 and had placed them in the care of a Catholic orphanage, and that neither child had ever been seen again. A man in New York wrote to say that his family had a story about an aunt who had been sent to a Lutheran home for unwed mothers in the 1880s, and that the baby had supposedly been adopted, but there were no records, no letters, no evidence that the child had ever existed. A historian in Massachusetts sent Sarah documents she had found in a parish archive letters from a deaconess who had run a foundling home in the 1890s and who had used eerily similar language to Sister Margarethe, writing about testing the strength of infants and returning the weak to God. These letters came from across the country, from different denominations, from different time periods, and they all pointed to the same terrible possibility, that what had happened at Street Judith's was not an isolated incident, that there had been other Sister Margarethes, other breathing rooms, other places where unwanted children had been taken and never seen again. Sarah began collecting these stories, cataloguing them, cross-referencing them with historical records. She didn't know yet if she would write another book, but she knew she couldn't ignore what she was finding, because the legacy of Street Judith's was not just about one church or one woman. It was about a system that had allowed this kind of violence to happen, that had hidden it, that had protected the perpetrators and erased the victims. And that system was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. In Pennsylvania, the state legislature responded to the scandal by passing a law in early 2024. It was officially called the Historical Child Welfare Transparency Act, but everyone referred to it as Anna's Law, named after Anna Bruckner, the only known survivor of the breathing room. The law required all religious institutions, orphanages, hospitals, and charitable organizations that had operated child welfare programs prior to 1950 to submit their historical records to the Pennsylvania State Archive for public access and review. The records would be digitized, indexed, and made searchable by genealogists, historians, and descendants. The law was designed to prevent cover-ups, to ensure that no institution could destroy evidence of abuse or neglect, and to give families the tools to find out what had happened to their relatives. It was a significant piece of legislation, and it was celebrated by child welfare advocates and historical justice organizations. But it was also contested. Some religious groups argued that it violated the separation of church and state, that it forced institutions to expose private matters, and that it unfairly targeted faith-based organizations. The law survived legal challenges and went into effect in July 2024, but compliance was slow. Many institutions claimed they no longer had records from that era, that files had been lost or destroyed in fires, floods, or routine purges. And without enforcement mechanisms, without penalties for non-compliance, the law's impact remained limited. The town of Lehigh County, meanwhile, remained divided. Some residents embraced the memorial garden and attended annual remembrance ceremonies. Others avoided the church entirely, refusing to acknowledge what had happened there. And a small but vocal group continued to insist that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion, that Sister Margarethe had been a woman of her time, that she had done the best she could with limited resources, and that judging her by modern standards was unfair. These were the people who refused to process the guilt. They refused to sit with the discomfort of knowing that their community, their church, their ancestors had been complicit in the deaths of 89 children. They preferred denial. They preferred silence. And in that silence, Sarah Klein heard the same refusal that had allowed Sister Margarethe to operate for nearly 2 decades. The refusal to ask questions, the refusal to demand accountability, the refusal to see what was right in front of them. Because confronting the truth required more than an apology or a memorial garden. It required a willingness to look at the parts of history that were ugly, shameful, and unforgivable, and not everyone was willing to do that. So the legacy of Street Judith's remained contested, unresolved, and deeply painful. The children had been found, their names had been spoken, but the town that had failed them was still deciding whether to remember or forget. Evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or chaos. It doesn't always wear a mask or hide in shadows. Sometimes it walks into a room with a soft voice and a kind smile. Sometimes it wears the clothes of the righteous and speaks the language of faith. Sometimes it offers help, promises salvation, and extends a hand to those who are desperate and afraid. And we accept that hand. We trust it, because we want to believe that goodness exists, that institutions can be relied upon, that people who dedicate their lives to God would never harm the innocent. But history has shown us, again and again, that evil does not need to scream to be heard. Sometimes it hums lullabies. And we let it, because listening, really listening, would require us to confront truths we are not prepared to face. Sister Margarethe Voss operated for nearly 2 decades in plain sight. She was not hiding. She was not working in secret. She ran a nursery attached to a church in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Mothers brought their babies to her door. Families donated money to support her work. The parish priest praised her from the pulpit. And yet, for 18 years, she placed infants in a windowless room and left them there to die. 89 children, at minimum, passed through her care and never came out alive. How did this happen? How did an entire community fail to see what was happening in their midst? The answer is uncomfortable, but it is not complicated. Sister Margarethe was able to kill because she was trusted. And she was trusted because she was useful. She served a function that the community needed. She took the problem of unwanted children, the illegitimate, the inconvenient, the shameful, and she made that problem disappear. She allowed families to maintain their reputations. She allowed mothers to return to their lives without the burden of a child they could not keep. She allowed the town to preserve its image of moral order, of Christian decency, of respectability, and in exchange, the community gave her permission to operate without scrutiny. They did not ask where the children went. They did not ask why so many were baptized but never buried. They did not ask to see inside the nursery or to verify that the infants were being cared for. They simply trusted. Because asking questions would have meant acknowledging that something was wrong. And acknowledging that something was wrong would have required them to do something about it. So they chose not to ask. They chose to believe the lie. And Sister Margarethe, who understood this dynamic perfectly, gave them exactly what they wanted. She gave them silence. She gave them discretion. She gave them a solution that allowed them to sleep at night. But Sister Margarethe was not just useful. She was also pious. She performed her role with the language and rituals of faith. She baptized the children. She prayed over them. She spoke of God's will and divine providence. She framed her actions not as cruelty but as mercy, not as murder but as a holy test. And because she used the vocabulary of religion, because she presented herself as a servant of God, the community accepted her authority. They did not question her methods. They did not challenge her theology. They did not ask whether a loving God would design a test that required infants to suffocate in darkness. Because questioning Sister Margarethe would have meant questioning the church itself. And the church was the foundation of their community, the source of their moral guidance, the institution they had been taught to revere above all else. To doubt the church was to doubt everything. So they did not doubt. They believed. And in their belief, they became complicit. This is the psychology of hidden evil. It does not operate alone. It operates within systems that protect it, within communities that enable it, within belief structures that justify it. Sister Margarethe Vos was a psychopath. Yes, she lacked empathy. She felt no remorse. She constructed an elaborate moral framework to rationalize the killing of children, and she executed that framework with methodical precision. But she could not have done what she did without the cooperation of the people around her. She could not have continued for 18 years without the silence of the mothers who suspected, the complicity of the fathers who paid her to stay quiet, the willful ignorance of the town that chose not to see. Evil requires more than one person. It requires a conspiracy of silence. It requires a collective agreement to look away. And that agreement is almost always rooted in self-interest, in comfort, in the desire to avoid uncomfortable truths. The question we must ask ourselves is this: how many other Sister Margarethes have existed? How many are operating right now? In places we trust, in institutions we revere, behind closed doors we have been taught not to open. The abuse scandals that have emerged in recent decades in churches, in schools, in orphanages, in youth programs, have revealed a pattern that is disturbingly familiar. A charismatic or pious individual gains the trust of a community. They are given authority over vulnerable people. They abuse that authority in ways that are hidden, systematic, and sustained. And when the abuse is finally discovered, we learn that others knew, or suspected, or heard rumors, but did nothing, because they did not want to believe it, because they valued the institution more than the victims, because speaking up would have been inconvenient, uncomfortable, or dangerous. This is not ancient history. This is not a problem that has been solved. This is happening now, and it will continue to happen as long as we prioritize reputation over accountability, as long as we protect systems instead of people, as long as we refuse to ask the questions that might reveal ugly truths. Sarah Klein understood this. She had spent 4 years uncovering the story of street Judiths, and in that time, she had come to realize that the real tragedy was not just what Sister Margarethi had done, but what the community had allowed her to do. The real tragedy was the silence, the refusal to intervene, the willingness to accept convenient lies instead of demanding difficult truths. And she knew that this pattern was not unique to one church or one century. It was a human pattern, a pattern of self-preservation, of moral cowardice, of choosing comfort over courage. And it was a pattern that would repeat itself unless people were willing to break it. On a cold evening in November 2024, Sarah stood in the memorial garden at Street Judiths as the sun began to set. The garden was quiet, empty, except for her. The trees that surrounded it had lost most of their leaves, and the bare branches cast long shadows across the rows of small granite headstones. Sarah walked slowly along the pathway, stopping at each stone, reading the names aloud. Anna Bruckner, Johann Hoffmann, Clara Reinhardt, Infant Unknown, number 12. Infant Unknown, number 27. Some of the names had been recovered from Sister Margarethi's list. Others had been identified through DNA matches with living descendants. But many remained unknown, marked only by numbers, their identities lost to time. Sarah read every name, every number, speaking them into the stillness. It took nearly 20 minutes. And when she finished, she stood at the center of the garden and looked at the gravestones stretching out in all directions. They were so small, and there were so many. She thought about the children who had died in that room. She thought about what their final hours must have been like. The darkness, the silence, the slow realization that no one was coming. She thought about the mothers who had left them there, trusting that the church would care for them, never knowing that they had delivered their babies into the hands of a killer. She thought about the fathers who had paid Sister Margarethi to make the problem go away, who had signed checks and walked away and never asked what happened next. She thought about the townspeople who had attended services every Sunday, who had sung hymns and recited prayers, while children suffocated 30 feet away. And she thought about Sister Margarethi herself, kneeling in prayer, believing with absolute certainty that she was serving God, that she was performing a holy act, that the deaths of 89 infants were evidence of her faithfulness. How could someone believe that? How could someone kill and feel peace? Sarah didn't have an answer, but she knew that the question mattered, because understanding how evil operates, understanding how it disguises itself, understanding how it relies on our silence and our complicity, was the only way to prevent it from happening again. The sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear. Sarah turned and walked toward the gate, leaving the garden behind. But the weight of it stayed with her. The weight of all those names, all those lives, all those unanswered cries. She thought about the anonymous letter that had been slipped under her hotel room door 4 years earlier, the letter that had started everything. It had said, they weren't stillborn. They were still breathing. And that was the truth. The children who died at Street Judiths were not stillborn. They were born alive. They were breathing. They were crying. And no one came. Not because no one heard them, but because no one wanted to hear them. Because hearing them would have meant doing something. And doing something would have meant disrupting the order, challenging the authority, questioning the faith. So the town chose silence, and the children died. And for over a century, their deaths were buried, forgotten, erased from history. Until someone finally asked the question that no one else had been willing to ask. Until someone finally refused to look away. We were told not to ask about the stillborns, but they were never still. They were crying, and no one came. That is the legacy of Street Judiths. That is the legacy of every institution that values its reputation more than the lives of the vulnerable. That is the legacy of every community that chooses comfort over truth. And it is a legacy that we must confront if we want to prevent it from repeating. Because the question is not whether evil like Sister Margaretha's could happen again. The question is whether we would recognize it if it did. Whether we would ask the hard questions. Whether we would believe the victims. Whether we would act, or whether we would do what so many before us have done. Turn away, stay silent, and let the children cry in the dark. What do you think? Could this happen again?